Hey, I am Mustafa Sharif. Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. Today, I have the pleasure to meet a great person, and we're gonna talk about a very interesting topic. All the way from UK, I have the pleasure to welcome Charles Landry to talk about creative bureaucracy. Hey, and welcome to Urbanistica podcast.
Hello, everybody, too. Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I mean, obviously, I'm at home quite a lot, but we'll see about travel. But let's just play it by ear. I've got a garden, so I can look out into that.
Yes, yes. Always see the positive side of the story.
Yeah, yeah.
And in which city are you living now in UK?
Well, I actually, and this is something people often ask me, I live in the middle of nowhere, but in normal times, which is called the Cotswolds, because I'm continually in cities, I sort of need the balance. You need great places, as you know, are a combination of the wild and the dense and the urban fabric, but also some places of calm. So for me, this is quite useful to reflect on things,
Yeah, so always keeping the balance.
ideally.
Yeah. And how is it going now after the summer and the COVID-19?
Well, obviously, everything went online, and I've done various things online. I had various pieces of work I was doing, quite a few big creative bureaucracy projects in places like South Australia. But also, the main thing I've been doing, which we'll come to much later, is trying to organize this Creative Bureaucracy Festival. But we'll come to that later.
Yeah. So, Charles, you are our storyteller. So please, how would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your passion?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. If someone said, and people ask me, what do you do? The easy answer would be to say, oh, I'm an urbanist. But, when I think of that, I sort of think, hey, I'm actually just interested in how people communicate, how they connect, how they walk, how they talk. I'm interested in the ordinary every day, and of course, the occasional extraordinary. So, what is this job that likes that? That likes being curious, nosy, that likes looking at things from a 360-degree way. In other words, trying to bring insights together from different disciplines and perhaps mixing the intuitive, the emotional, and the rational. So, but what I actually do, I suppose, is I help cities or work with cities. I always call it being a critical friend. It's not that I necessarily know, but trying to bring the views of the outsider who may be fresh and the insider who may not see the wood for the trees. And in an ideal world, we're then trying to see how these cities can transform or achieve their ambition.
Yeah.
You asked me about passion, didn't you? Passion. That's a good one. I've already used the word that is my passion, which is actually curiosity. I love curiosity. When I invented, so to say, the sort of creative city idea, I then thought many years later, no, where does it start? It starts with curiosity. If you're curious, you might be imaginative. If you're imaginative, you might have an interesting idea. If those turn into reality, it might be an invention. If it's widespread, it might become an innovation. And so the circle goes on. So, what I also like is I just like going into factories, into hotels, and then finding out how does it work? How much money do you make? I really love knowing that. How does your restaurant work? How many meals can you produce with 8 people in a kitchen? Uh, are you an Iraqi cook cooking Italian food, or are you actually cooking Iraqi food?
Yeah.
These are the things I love knowing. I mean, I love talking to people who have a background that's completely different from me. So I'm just interested. I know this sounds very general, but that's really what gets me going.
Yeah, that's wonderful. But tell me, when did this passion to cities, to people start? Is it when you were young in a university or when you started to practice?
I think I've always been a bit like that. I mean, I had 5 brothers and sisters, so there's a lot of, you can imagine I was the youngest, so there were a lot of people, a lot of noise around and things like that. And I only, I suppose, self consciously said to myself, this is what I like when people sort of asked me, what do you like? And then I sort of felt I couldn't say, oh, I like physics and engineering and something like that, or economics. I sort of said the sort of things we're talking about. But I mean, so the people thing can sound a bit sort of hackneyed and like a cliche, but in the end, what is the city but the people, as Shakespeare said? You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm very thankful that you give your time to record this podcast and this episode. So thank you so much again for your time.
Oh no, that's absolutely fine. I mean, you were going to ask me, I think, a question about how did all this creative bureaucracy business start, and I think, I hope you don't mind, but I have to go back a bit because it stems from the creative city notion that in the late 80s I sort of evolved. Obviously, there are other people, there was an atmosphere, various people around the world that I communicated with. And at that time, one of the things that was clear to me, I was interested in how people express themselves fully. I mean, that was really my impulse. How do you be what you really want to be? And so I could have talked about and concentrated for 30, 40 years on the individual,
Mhm.
you know, who are you? Who are you, Mustafa? Why are you like you are? I could have focused on the organization. How do you create an interesting organization? But what I liked, and partly because I've travelled a bit because of work and so on, I was interested in the city simply because it's so complex. It's got lots of cultures, and I wanted to dive into the complexity within which organizations and individuals fit. And this came also, this complexity, because my parents were immigrants, a bit like you. They escaped from the Nazis. They weren't Jewish, but they worked for a Jewish publisher. My mother was a journalist, my father a philosopher. You know, you can imagine Hitler didn't like them. And so they came to Britain. I was brought up there. I was brought up then in Germany and Italy. So you can see again why I felt that culture was very important. The culture of people, the culture of organizations, and all of that. And, one of the things I was asking myself, who the hell am I? What am I? What's my mixed identity? I mean, perhaps I sound very British, but I'm a melange, a mix up of various things. And so that's how it all started through the Creative City thing. And initially, what I then did, and obviously with colleagues, and so we worked with many cities, and initially the creative city thing was seen as very much about art and culture, which is absolutely fine because there were dramatic transformations. The world was changing. So you could say, well, what are you? What have you got as your city? Well, one thing you've got is who you are, expressed often through art. And then through time, uh, it became clear to me that there are other forms of creativity that individuals show, social innovations, planning innovations, business innovations, and so on. And that over time, I suppose the simple sentence about all of that, a 300-page book in one sentence is, in a world of dramatic change, how do you create the conditions for people to think, plan, and act with imagination to solve problems and create opportunities? So that gives you a bit of idea. So I was widening things, and I suppose slowly we come very slowly to the bureaucrat.
Yeah. So, when did you start to talk about the creative bureaucracy officially? Like, okay, you started to use this term.
Yeah, that's a good question because we jumped, over 20 years, and there was a lot of, you can imagine the sort of thing. And but the whole notion of creativity and creative city became a bit sort of overtaken by the idea that it's only about hipsters and
Yeah.
it's only about cool people and boring people who do urban planning. They're boring, and bureaucrats are boring. Everyone's boring. I'm exaggerating, of course, but the trigger for me it started for me in 2003, and we still had a residue of I suppose, the culture of Margaret Thatcher, which basically said things like, there is no society, uh, anyone in a public administration is inefficient, incapable, incompetent, all of these sort of words. And at the same time, as you well know, there was this new public management ideology, which essentially tried to make the public sector like a business. Now, clearly, they can learn things from business things, but of course, the criteria of success and failure in a public institution is something completely different. And what was particularly interesting to me was the key issue was, there is a public interest, there is a common good, there is a common purpose, all of these things which were being, in a sense, downgraded. Now, when I talk about creative bureaucracy, I don't necessarily assume that every public administrator is a wonderful person. Of course not. The same is true in private business or the civil sector. But the notion, I just wanted to change the narrative. And that's why I put these two words together. And it's probably the last time I'll use the word creative, because it's, of course, overused, as you well know. So I put these two words together as a provocation, in a sense, to signal to the bureaucrat, which is a negative word, this positive word, creative, and saying to the bureaucrat, actually, you're imaginative too, potentially. You've got something to offer. And not every bureaucrat is stupid. There are 80 million civil servants in Europe. You include teachers and all of these people as well, several hundred million in the world. And so for me, I was trying to think, how can you create an empowerment drive in some sense? And the interesting point was that I wanted to make people go, what the hell do you mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean by this word? So there we are. I don't know. You were asking another question, I suppose, what it is. But in 2003 onwards, it didn't really get traction. Yeah, people thought that I was making a joke or something like that, and it took a long time to slowly shift to be taken more seriously.
Yeah. And did you notice that, let's say, municipalities started to think more positive, or to consider this as a serious thing when you started to use creative bureaucracy, when you changed the storytelling?
Yeah. It took a long time, to tell you the truth. And because I'm not really a bureaucrat, or perhaps I am a bureaucrat, I don't know. But the only bureaucracy I worked, my first job as a young man, was at the European Union. So I experienced something there. And then I once worked at the World Bank about 23 years ago for a year. So I've experienced, but not very much, these big institutions. But then I've been working a lot in Adelaide with a woman who was a senior bureaucrat and then went independent. And I asked her, I said, I've been doing these series of books on themes, like psychology and the city, how do you become an ambitious city, all of these types of things, the sensory landscape of cities, that type of stuff. And I asked her, this Margie Korst, who then became the co-author of the little book, I said, would you write this little book with me? Because you know the inside and I'm perhaps on the outside. And perhaps the combination is the thing that we can put something together. And that was very significant, because she highlighted different things than I would have highlighted
Yeah.
in the theme.
Yeah, that's why you needed her in this journey, because the different disciplinary.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, if I were to summarize, what is the creative bureaucracy about, I would say there are probably three pillars. I mean, firstly, we need to recognize the world's changing. That's the basic starting point. Secondly, the first pillar then is, how do you create incentives and regulations that are right for this time we're in? How do you improve the inner life of the bureaucracy, where Margie was so important, from her own experience? How do you allow people within a system to to give of their best, all of that sort of stuff. And thirdly, how do you engage better with that business and civic world outside? Because the creative bureaucracy isn't only about public servants. I mean, you said you do master planning with cities and municipalities. You, you know, you're not one world and the other is another world. You're working together. You're trying to make the best result.
Yeah.
So we always say it's creative bureaucrats and their allies, i.e., people at least have one sense of one common understanding that there is something that we want to make better. There is a common good.
Yeah. So as you we talked about recording this episode before. We talked a bit, and you mentioned moving from no because to yes if. How do we create this culture? Who is the first or who is the main responsible for this?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mustafa, because often, when you do things and you write books or something or whatever, you try to create slogans. And so I sort of invented that slogan as an encapsulation, which essentially means being more open than closed, rather than saying it won't work, just sort of thinking of it, could it work? And that in itself, I feel, empowers individuals because they're then listening. If you're more in the yes if culture rather than we've tried it before. Now, that doesn't mean everything has to be thrown up in the air and changed. So the question there really is, you're saying, is who is the catalyst? And it has to, I think, be quite synchronistic. I mean, in reality, in terms of creative bureaucracy, if you look at the experiences, it's often legitimized from the top somehow. And if that happens in a big institution, then the people at different levels feel empowered to do stuff and do things. Now, that activates, let's call it, the bottom. Now, at the same time, once this is more mature, the bottom itself creates a pressure that goes up to the top that says we must change. So it's this interesting sort of combination, which is obviously very complex. So I would say, as we develop, you want the main institutions, let's say the traditional institutions, to begin to see that this makes sense because the world's in a new phase. But you want responsible businesses. You want businesses to say, look, I know I'm whatever, trying to make a profit or whatever and do my best, but I'm working in a context. I'm in a society. We're doing things together. And therefore also to feel open to this. And the civic world is usually quite open to this in any case. But the question is that it isn't about who's in charge, it's how can we solve problems together better? And there are lots of examples I could give if you wish. I mean, I'll give you one or two if you like.
Yes, please.
Well, I mean, for example, a big ally of ours is the South Australian government and Adelaide, the city. And the woman there who used to be in manufacturing, who is now the head of the commissioner or whatever it's called for public reform, Irma Ranieri, developed something called the 90-day project, where you or I or an internal administrator could say, I want this problem solved in 90 days. And everything was then focused on solving these problems. Some clearly worked, some were more difficult. But one to do with domestic violence, for example, was so easy once everybody had their mind on it. There was a negative case, tragic case about violence, domestic violence. The police, this is in Adelaide, said, oh, that's a domestic problem. The woman, unfortunately, died. They then said, someone said from education, if you'd asked me, I would have known there's a problem. Someone from social services said, I knew that was a problem. The solution was that all these entities just sat round a table as all these calls came in every day. I think it's 50 a day. So you see some of the problems to solve are easy. I mean, another example, and Gabriela Gomez-Mont, who you obviously know well, Laboratorio para la Ciudad, she was asked to set up a laboratory, and there are many labs, and perhaps there are too many labs around the world, but these are all experimentation things, where she crowdsourced a constitution for Mexico City, uh, based on human rights issues, where she defined something called Mapathon, where they created a map of the 30,000 public buses and so on. So there are lots of mechanisms. Uh, Another one you'll know is Mind Lab, started in 2002, which the Danish government set up to sort of challenge its own system. So anyway, I suppose the landscape's changed because people do realize we have to respond. Business as usual won't get us to where we need to be.
Exactly. So if I understand you correctly, it's not only a top-down anymore. It's a shared responsibility.
Completely right. You've said it in a much shorter, concise way. That's right. I mean, another way of saying it, Mustafa, is to say uh, great city making is a collective endeavor, is
Yeah,
another way of saying the same thing you've just said. So it's really one of the difficulties here is obviously we have different backgrounds, different trainings or education, stuff like that. So it's often trying to find a common language and a common sense of what the priorities are. And that can sometimes be difficult. But I think we know that if you took, for example, the street, your innovation agency, Vinnova in Stockholm, is really trying to completely rethink streets. And what they're saying, they're working in a transdisciplinary way, not multidisciplinary. Multidisciplinary, environment says this, transport says that, these are my rules. And then you get something which is some spaghetti that doesn't work as a street. Whereas if you and I and others say, what makes a great street? And we define it, diversity, walkability, whatever. And then you say, what can you contribute to that great street? You're more likely to get a better result.
yeah. So if we have a kind of a clear model to how to be more creative, what is the challenge that we are facing now in order to share this responsibility and to come together?
Well, yeah, they are entrenched ways of thinking and behaving and so on. It's obviously to do with power structures, fear of the imagination, and fear of change. Now, obviously, I'm saying let's be open and change. I often in my own life are saying, no, 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 don't do that. Keep things as they are. So I'm not saying that I'm a beacon of wonderfulness or anything like that. But these are essentially the problems. The other problem is this very difficult balance between routine and doing something new and rethinking. Because most people in their job have a job that sort of is full, if I put it that simply. And then for someone to say, well, now you need to change, it's like an extra job on top. And so this is very difficult to try and shift the culture of an organization so that they feel the changing process or reassessing process is a part of the job. And one of the dangers has been in the periods of austerity, and you probably have experienced this yourself in your work, that the one section that is often cut in a local authority or government is the foresight team, the team that is thinking ahead, the team that's trying to be prepared,
Mm.
which, as you know, in the pandemic happened in many countries and therefore probably created lots and lots of problems. And so this thinking ahead aspect should be also even a part of a routine job. Because even routine things, which may seem mechanical, also have lots of little radical potential changes that are in them. So it's not sort of this is fixed and this is fluid. It's more this allowing the structure of a job to be more merged in that way.
Yeah. And how do you think that we can change this and become more flexible, more creative?
Um, I think one of the most important ways is partly through example. I think, I mean, example and crisis. When I wrote the Creative City, the first one, a long time ago, uh, Christ, it was a long time ago. Um, I was basically saying the use of crisis is a wonderful tool. I mean, crisis, as you know, in Chinese means opportunity and threat. So uh, if the situation is bad enough, then people will react. Clearly, the pandemic has shown how innovative people can be, how suddenly they can switch to do things they thought were never possible in a shorter period of time. So crisis is one thing. Now, before the pandemic, you could have said to many places where things were going okay, there's no urgency. And that's then becomes quite difficult because there's not the urgency to act if there isn't a sort of threat. A typical threat in terms of cities is often the competitive threat. Your city is not doing as well as that city. Spain is doing better than Sweden. Aren't you catching up? So these are the sort of triggers that overcome them. But one of the ways of being more creative is things like the European Capital of Culture, is having targets where you say there is a deadline. So typically in a capital of culture, you would say, let's try this. And someone will say, oh, that sounds ridiculous. Yeah. You say, well, it's only a thing for this event. And then if it works, as it did various things in Umeo, you can mainstream them. So that's another mechanism. So crisis, then this point about setting yourself a target through a deadline, the two of them. The basic thing we have to do is obviously the culture change thing. And you know as well as anyone that culture change is really takes a long time. So I think what one needs to do is create contexts where people feel relaxed about talking, relaxed about being honest, relaxed about feeling they're not saying the right thing. And a lot of that is to do with emotional intelligence on the part of leadership. And when I say leadership, I don't mean a city has one leader. A city like Stockholm, I hope, has 10,000 leaders. But that there is a different spirit of leadership. And that, of course, is already happening because you can't just boss people around in the old fashioned way. So those are three things I would stress for the moment.
Yeah. And tell me more about the festival and the relationship to placemaking.
Well, it's a very good point. I mean, we're collaborating with Placemaking Europe, which is an important organization in thinking about placemaking and urban planning and stuff like that. Where it fits is, I'll restate what I said earlier. The whole project is about how do you rethink how you think, act, and plan. And a lot of what I've said is about the 360-degree perspective. And if we look at places from that, we feel that they need to be different than planned and executed before. This is where the hardware, the software all comes together. And it means different skills around the table. I mean, great placemaking for me is about understanding the psychology of people, how they experience place, but also their ambitions in terms of, I'm using an old fashioned word now, beauty. We can argue what is beautiful, but just having these aspirations for that rather than just thinking it's purely functional. And I think once that works with the flow of both people's functional needs like walkability, but also their more spiritual, soulful needs, that's when great places come to be, I think, personally.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I love the way how you describe what is placemaking because this is what I think we need it now. As this is the magic of a new way of thinking, of doing it a bit differently that how we used to do it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I hope that this placemaking movement that is evolving gains more and more power. Because as you look at historically about urban planning, and you will know that quite often people say who's in charge? Well, it's the technical planner, and then another period, it's the economic development person who knows about things. And urban design, which I think placemaking very much is within that, was a younger sort of sibling of this. And thank God, this more comprehensive discipline has actually risen in status, and particularly that understanding that the best of it has of, all these words can sound like cliches, people, place, planet, all of these things merged, you know. I think you've got to trigger people's imagination. I mean, like if you said, let's be more sustainable, I think a good way of doing it is creating a space where you can feel it's sustainable through the symbols and whatever, where you don't sort of say, like a school teacher, you must be sustainable. You can feel it in the actual environment. And this is such a beautiful challenge for combinations of physical planners, artistic people, psychologists, and others to come together. I just think it's, well, I know I'm sounding a bit too lyrical, but I think it's all quite beautiful if it comes together.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think there's the magic happening when these different creative minds comes together.
I agree with you, Mustafa. Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me about the festival.
Well, the festival, the origins were, I was in Berlin. I was living there as a fellow of some academy. I mean, normally I'm doing work with cities, but they gave me money for 3 months. And I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. I haven't had this for 40 years. So I'm just giving money for 3 months. Um, so I met the publisher of the main Berlin paper called Der Tagesspiegel, someone called Sebastian Turner. And I sort of, like a little boy, was saying, "Oh, could you publicize a little event I want to do about creative bureaucracy?" And then he said something that's never been said to me before. He said, "This is the project I've been waiting for." It
Wow.
was a lovely sentence. And what he said is, every day I slag off and complain about the bureaucracy to my 180,000 readers who are public administrators. And secondly, I also ask them to pay me to buy the paper. That's a bad idea. Why can't we try and be positive? And through that, and because he had a team, obviously, in his paper, who was the publisher or a co-publisher, we were able to launch something in 2018 that had about, over time in the 2 days, 1,200 people come from 20 countries. The
Wow.
same was true. I mean, they weren't always in one place, because you know what conferences are like. And then the same amount in 2019. Then we had to go remote digital. So we've been working sort of since March on this. And I think we're going to have about 50 sessions in English, which is quite a lot of hours, and 50 in German. And, it'll be all online and a YouTube live, but then people can look at it later. There's a sort of highlight hour where people have, this is the 20-second snapshot. Here
Yeah.
is something amusing, just something like a sort of TV show. But the themes, if you want to know them, there are sort of 6 themes or so. One of them is learning from. What can we learn from Latin America? What can we learn from Africa? What can we learn from Asia? Yeah. What can we learn from civil society? What can we learn from festival organizers? The other one theme is about silver lining. Is there anything in the problem that is an opportunity? What is there some sort of light within the dark? That's another theme. A third theme is creative bureaucrats in their own words. And these are just sort of interviews, 25 minutes, 20 minutes or so, of people we think are inspiring. Margie is being interviewed, the co-author, someone called Tommy Laitio from Helsinki, young guy who suddenly came to be number 3 in the city, but you just know that he's emotionally intelligent. A
Yeah.
wonderful woman who set up, Tonya Sermon, who set up the Centre for Civic Social Innovation in Toronto. 900 entities are in her 3 buildings. People who I think we would like. Another woman, sorry, these are all women. There are also guys, don't worry. um, called Susan Pettifer, who won the award for changing the whole culture of the city of Sydney around, etc., etc. Then the fourth theme is energy from below, which we're putting in people like Stipo, Placemaking Europe. They're contributing to that. So that's about co-creating spaces, I suppose, as one element. And the final two is one is the innovative ecosystem. How all do these little bits fit together? How do they fit together? You know, is it just a few fragments, people doing a bit of this and a bit of that, and it has no power? How can we create power out of this? And the last one is about, sounds perhaps a bit dry, is becoming a public servant, which is really about what is the new job description for a public servant? What would they do? What do they do? How do they behave? You know, you
Yeah,
get the idea, I'm
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
I mean, people can, if they want, I mean, you may or may not at the end just put the website, but if people go under creativebureaucracy.org, they can download my book for free and all of that and register if they want. The events from the 28th of September to the 2nd of October.
yeah. I will include the link so people can get like direct access to it, so they
So
don't
anyway,
need
they
to.
can get the free information basically.
Yeah, that's a really great mix of different topics, different people, different countries. How did you manage to bring all of them together?
You know what it's like. I mean, I think they're now, hopefully, let's hope the technology and everything works and so on, different contributions from 30 countries. Um, Initially, as you know what it's like, you start with your own contacts and then the contacts of contacts of contacts. It's that logic. Um, and I mean, I know that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but I kept on thinking, and you ask other people, who do you think is interesting? I mean, for example, uh, those people I just mentioned, I know and are friends, but we've got a link with the BMW Foundation, and they suggested some people for a program they've got on cities that I'd never heard of. A woman from India, someone from Chile, and stuff like that. And you just say, "Oh, that's great! I've never heard of Rodrigo. I've never heard of Elsa De Silva or something." You know how it works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm looking forward this festival and well done.
Well, that's very nice of you to say that.
So now I will ask some personal question or how to say challenging the personal thoughts. So if you go back in time in a time machine and you are allowed to change one thing related to urban planning and design of cities, what will you change?
Well, I like that question a lot. I mean, I like all of your personal questions. They're on the one hand, some of them are funny, but at the same time, deep, perhaps stupid, but very interesting. Do you know what I mean? A question like that can make you think. Look, obviously, on the one hand, that's a difficult question, but thinking about it, the one thing I would change is that we see transdisciplinary working as the norm. That does not denigrate or devalue the specialist knowledge, but that we have this combined knowledge. And I think if we work in this way, we then, I don't know, our communication skills are enhanced, but we also need new skills and things like that. So that would be the main thing. So that becomes the norm, which gets us back to one of your main interests, which is urban design and planning.
Yeah, yeah,
Transdisciplinary teams are better than only specialists.
exactly. And if you're allowed to add one thing to the cities, what will you add?
You mean add in terms of a rule or a what?
Yeah, you decide.
Oh, yeah, because there's one thing that, because I'm just thinking, because you're speaking from Stockholm, I'm interested in the whole circular economy thing, which is very well developed in the Nordic countries. So I would again have that circular economy thinking there. So that's all part of the same thing, 360-degree thinking. If you said rule, yeah, because we have codes, rules, and all of this procedures and processes, which is again a good question. Um, I think it would be that when you're recruiting people, now we're talking about the public administration, uh, you would have as one criterion in recruiting them, whether it's a routine job or any job, the notion of being willing to be imaginative in the recruitment criteria. The other part of that same story is then in the annual evaluation to again say, were they willing to test the boundaries? Were they willing, if we want to use the word creative, be creative? Were they willing? And that doesn't mean, as I said before, everything needs to change, but it's just being willing to be open. So that would be probably my rule.
Yeah, yeah. I love it because I also always tell people around me that step zero is the will to change. You don't need to do everything already on step one or zero, but
Yeah,
at least you need to have the mindset of accepting or wanting, willing to change.
yeah. No, I completely agree with you, Mustafa.
Also, in this podcast, I talk a lot about and explore what is a smart city.
Uh-huh.
So, if I might ask you, what do you think, or how do you imagine a smart city?
Well, I mean, the whole question of the smart city is very contentious and so on. And I wrote a book, a small one of my small books called The Digitized City: Delights and Dilemmas. Um, and I think the basic consensus about a smart city is obviously you try and use technology as an enabling device to do various things. We all know, as with all technologies, there's the flip side, the control side. AI, who is actually defining the actual code inside it. You know, I mean, there's a very interesting thing I read the other day about AI in Africa. Does it actually understand the culture within which this is supposed to operate, the AI? So I think everybody knows about those dangers and so on. And that's then all about things like privacy laws and lots of other things as well. But I think the key thing about it is when it and if it um, actually makes us more competent and allows us, is used in a way, these technologies, to make us being able to contribute better. Now, this is where we get into the open source issues, crowdsourcing stuff, all of those types of things, using citizen knowledge to help inform, I don't know, planning decisions and so on. Using, I don't know, interesting platforms to find solutions that you might need in your city, but harvesting the globe in one way or another. So I think I mean, again, this is a bit of a cliche. If any of this helps us to become smart citizens, then I think it's all very good. I mean, the word smart for me, I mean, in American English, smart sort of sounds okay. There's a funny feeling. Smart, I think in UK, Britain, Europe sounds a bit, I'm smart. You're not smart, I'm smart. You know what I mean? So I have a slight feeling about it, but it's fine. If people want to use the word smart, that's fine by me.
Do you believe the creative bureaucracy is a part of smart city?
If you define smartness as creating good, helpful solutions, you being a contributor in helping these solutions happen, in that case, yes, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much again for the very inspiring answers.
No, pleasure.
So now is more how to say then the step number two of the personal question. So question number one, if you will be an animal, which animal will you choose and why?
Yeah, that was interesting. That's one of those which is a silly question, but a deep question. Um, I immediately thought of something which is a bad answer, which is a combination of a cat and a dog. The reason I'm saying that is a dog is, the often when it's quite loving and all of that, and loves you and is very pleased to see you in the morning and all of that. So you have that sort of sense of generosity and so on. And the cat is sort of quite magisterial. Yes, you might be able to stroke me, or maybe not. And so, what that represents to me is this combination of openness, because I think I'm sometimes quite open perhaps over enthusiastic or whatever. But actually, when you get to know me as well, I'm actually quite sort of
Yeah.
reserved. I have a
Yeah.
combination of that. But to answer then, perhaps because recently I did get a dog. We used to have dogs, and then we decided to get one the other day. I saw three wonderful tan working retrievers run up my lane, and I thought, "Shit, I want one of them." So I now have got this dog who's 4 months old. So I'll probably say a dog.
Yeah. So as you mentioned in the beginning, you mentioned that you are a critical friend.
Yeah.
So this is also a mix between the dog, the cat, like in between, you know?
Yes. Oh, I must say something on that. It's really interesting you bring that up because you know the way you create your life story, essentially retrospectively, you often tell your own story to yourself. I'm born on the 1st of July. So I've decided that's exactly in the middle of the year.
Yeah.
So I think my role in life is to bring perhaps practice and reflection together, or this and that, to try and harmonize. So you can
Yeah.
see perhaps there's a thread of me wishing to harmonize or balance.
Yeah, that's a really good story. And Charles, you worked a lot with cities and visited cities. So which city is your favorite one?
I mean, you know, because people have asked you that question as well, I'm sure. And it's sort of one of those, probably quite difficult because how many cities do you really, really, really know? So I can only respond to ones that I feel I really know rather than just visit, um, whatever that may be. So I have to say, I do think that Amsterdam's high on my list, partly because of the density and the sort of partly, the outdoor stuff that happens, in streets where you have benches and all of that. There's a sort of intimacy there, which I like. I like Berlin, which is partly to do with my history. I mean, Berlin as a physical fabric
Mm.
is a bit magisterial,
Yeah.
unter den Linden. Obviously other areas are different, Prenzlauer Berg and Kreuzberg and so on, and the West, the former West. But because of my history with my parents and stuff like that, you often have emotional attachments, even though you might not say this is a great, beautiful place or whatever. So anyway, Berlin is one of my second ones. A third one, if you don't mind me mentioning a few, is Helsinki because I've had a relationship with them for 25 years. And for me, it's great because I'm sort of, let's say, doing presentations and
Yeah.
I'm all over enthusiastic and they're all silent. You know what I mean? And I sort of love
Yeah.
that. And I love the sort of combination of their sort of 1st of May madness, but at the same time, once you get through it, they're real friends. They're real friends.
Yeah.
And, you have wonderful things. I remember Slush, their big innovation festival. One of the first themes they had for welcoming it in November, they said, "Welcome the dark, embrace the cold." That's such a wonderful confidence to be able to say that. The other two I'll just quickly mention is Taipei. I mean, Taipei, again, has this diversity, because many people from many parts of China came. Lots of interesting food, lots of interesting small shops and stuff, a bit like Amsterdam and a Chinese style. And finally, I have to say, I really like Chicago.
It's a really diverse cities and then the scale and
Yeah, some are
identity.
intimate, some are more. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess now it's super hard to decide what is your favorite public space and what is your favorite building.
Yeah, yeah. I saw you going down from.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I think I have to say that the public space that immediately came into my mind was Millennium Park in Chicago. I mean, the Jaime Prenza sculpture and the Anish Kapoor cloud gate and the way people interact with these is just incredible. Um, that in the Prenza thing, these two columns where 3,000 Chicago people come up all every minute or two, and then they squirt water. I mean, I've seen sort of wonderful ways of people interacting with that space. I mean, clearly, just to, Highline is obviously wonderful. Of course, there are too many people now, and we're all tourists in that sense. And thirdly, I have to say, just being very traditional and nostalgic, you have to say Piazza del Campo in Siena is absolutely fabulous. I mean, you see all the powers around at the market. I don't know, political power on one side, learning power. I mean, it's a beautiful assemblage. So
Yeah.
those are three little examples.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Would you like to visit them now, especially now during the corona, you want to travel and
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to be in all three of them now. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
well, Charles, what
The
are your
building.
hope? Yeah.
Yeah, he said, yeah, now the building. Okay. Another one of my slippery answers. I mean, what I like most is actually a street with quite smallish houses, which are why I said Amsterdam I quite like. And then in that street is quite diverse shops or something like that, and then people live above them. Okay, so it's an assemblage of small buildings. Okay, you might not be satisfied with that.
Yeah.
Okay, I could then say, and I'm thinking of buildings because we often think then of the Guggenheim and those sorts of buildings, which some of them are obviously very impressive. But the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, where people had a map of the destroyed community, which was thrown out in 1961 into a favela type place a long way away. And then people put their building and their name on the floor of this Baptist church and are recreating, in a sense, the community on the floor. And when I first saw that in Cape Town,
Wow.
I probably was near tears because you just, obviously I don't, for obvious reasons. So that's a building like that. But I mean, to again be a bit cliched, I suppose I've grown to like my own building where I live.
That's good. Well, a part of cities and developing cities, what are your hobbies?
Well, from the way I've been talking, you can probably feel that my hobby is just talking to you, being a bit curious, and so that actually is my hobby. I mean, and that's can be a real pleasure when it works well. I particularly love conversation, isn't a conversation which isn't about me exchanging prejudices, where you're sort of open and you're just sort of exploring. I just love and that the Spanish phrase sobremesa, where you're just having a meal and you've had a meal, you're just talking a bit, and then someone brings something else in. Most of the people you know, but there are a couple of new people you don't know, but everybody's relaxed. So that's my sort of sobremesa feeling is creating that. I perhaps don't create it. My partner Susie is fantastic at creating it. Requires the skill of hosting
Yeah.
and being in that. And I don't think I'm a good host in the sense of the maker of it, but I love being inside that which has been hosted. The other thing I like, I mean, my friends know that I like that, is being basically incredibly silly.
Like the cat and the dog
Yeah,
thing.
that sort of thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, but that's really beautiful. I almost share the same as the one you mentioned, the first point, that when you talk and when you learn, when you listen. And so far I did 120 episode, and I think you're one of absolutely great storytellers and easy to talk to, easy to joke with.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's nice of you to say that. I mean, for me, it's very pleasurable. I can't say the word pleasurable, partly because, we're both being very informal, relaxed, etc., etc., like sobremesa. I mean,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
doing virtual sobremesa here.
Well, great. Thank you so much again for giving your time, for inspiring us. Now is absolutely the last question. So, how would you like to summarize what we talked about, your reflections, and three takeaway messages to all the listeners?
Well, I suppose my three takeaway messages are: we're at a dramatic moment. Many people think the the old normal, is an exotic destination, but we had a glimpse of what was possible. I mean, we had the biggest experiment in climate change, emissions reduction, for example, clean air, birds singing, and so on. So, my first message is this is an opportunity, even in the negative situation we're in. So, that's my first message. My second message is that if we see cities as a collective and shared endeavor in making, shaping, and co creating that, then we need to be working in this more transdisciplinary, imaginative, ideal way. And thirdly, that there are so many examples out there of great people and great organizations who are doing really interesting things. And these are often unsung heroes. And these unsung heroes we need to project. And that's what our festival is about, in part, is projecting the unsung hidden heroes.
Yeah. Thank you so much again for the powerful takeaway messages.
Thank you.
Are you good in hashtags?
I haven't got my hashtag just immediately. You mean my own hashtag or whatever?
I need three hashtags for the episode.
You mean like hashtag creative bureaucracy or something like that? I'm
Yes.
not so good at the hashtags.
Okay, let's
Let's
try.
do hashtag public space
Yeah, two more.
and hashtag Mustafa.
Okay, this is gonna be trendy. So the third one,
Uh, the third one is civic imagination.
yes, that's a really good one. So what is the next tip for you? What are you going to do?
Well, the next step for the moment, we're speaking here at the end of August, is to try and hope that we and the team can make that the festival work. And then I think a period of reflection, because I've seen so many good things written in the last 7 months, and I felt I've got nothing to add to any of this. And I just want to reflect a bit about what it all means. And I know that sounds a bit too general, but that's actually where I think my mind is at.
Yeah, yeah. Wish you all the good luck with the festival, with the other project, with the reflection, and hopefully see you in the coming episode with more interesting topics as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mustafa. Very enjoyable.
Thank you. And thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. This podcast was recorded in collaboration with Placemaking Europe Network. If you have any great story that makes our city smarter, please contact me. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities. So we're done.
Great. Okay, that was